think she's New
Millionaire
York's new
mocked
it
his
girl.
wife as ugly for 10
Yes, her
years.
style is
She came back
impeccable.
as New York's most stunning model, loved by a man who truly deserves her. Hi, my beautiful family. Let us start with a prayer from the depths of my heart. Dear God, bless my beautiful family with endless love, peace, and joy. May every step they take be guided by your light. May their hearts always be filled with hope, and may their homes overflow with warmth and happiness. Protect them from sorrow. Turn their tears into smiles, and may every challenge in their lives make them stronger and wiser. Let love surround them always, and may they feel your presence in every moment of their lives. Amen. My family, every story I tell, every word I speak comes from my heart. You are my strength, my hope, my happiness. Your love gives me courage, your trust gives me purpose, and your presence makes every effort I put into these stories meaningful. I share everything with you because you are more than viewers. You are my family, my heart, my life. If your heart is true, right, present. If your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. We are one family, bound by love, trust, and memories we create together, forever. Please don't forget to subscribe to my new channel, Mr. Peter Family, for short videos under 1 hour, made with all my love, just for you. The champagne bubbles rose like tiny prayers in the crystal flutes as Manhattan's elite toasted the wedding of the decade at the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom. Amelia Washington had never felt more beautiful. The Vera Wang gown, custom-made with hand-sewn pearls that caught the light like captured stars, transformed her into something ethereal. Each pearl had been individually selected and placed by the designer's most skilled seamstresses, creating patterns that seemed to flow like water across the silk. Her natural curls had been swept into an elegant chignon that took 3 hours to perfect, with tendrils artfully arranged to frame her face in a way that made her look like she'd stepped out of a Renaissance painting. Her grandmother's vintage pearl necklace, a family heirloom from Harlem's golden age, worn by 3 generations of Washington women, rested against her collarbones like a blessing from the ancestors who'd fought for her to have this moment. "You're absolutely radiant, darling," whispered her maid of honor, Jessica, as they stood before the gilded mirrors in the bridal suite. The room itself was a masterpiece, with hand-painted murals depicting cherubs and roses, crystal chandeliers that threw rainbow light across the marble floors, and fresh white orchids that filled the air with their delicate perfume. Charles is the luckiest man in New York, hell, the luckiest man in America. But it was Charles Blackstone himself who made Amelia feel like she was living in a fairy tale. At 38, he commanded every room he entered with the confidence that came from old money and new success. His real estate empire stretched across Manhattan's most prestigious neighborhoods, the Upper East Side, Tribeca, Soho, and his developments had reshaped the city's skyline. His connections read like a who's who of New York society. Mayors and senators, celebrities and titans of industry, old money families whose names were carved into library cornerstones and hospital wings. "You know what you are?" Charles murmured in her ear during their first dance, his hand warm and possessive against the small of her back, as they swayed to Frank Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight." The photographer, a society legend who'd captured 3 decades of Manhattan weddings, moved around them like a ghost, his camera clicking softly as he documented every angle of their perfection. Charles cut a striking figure in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, the fabric so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been painted onto his athletic frame. "What am I?" she whispered back, her heart full of love and dreams and the intoxicating possibility of a future that stretched endlessly before them. "You're going to be the most beautiful model New York has ever seen," he said, his voice low and intimate, meant only for her ears. "I'll make sure every agency in Manhattan knows your name. Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, Elle, Marie Claire, they'll all want you. You have something special, Amelia. Something the cameras will love. That bone structure, those eyes, that natural grace, it's exactly what the industry is looking for. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. At 22, fresh from Columbia University with a degree in art history and a minor in photography, she'd harbored secret dreams of modeling since she was 12 years old, posing in front of her bedroom mirror and imagining herself on magazine covers. She'd studied the great fashion photographers, Avedon, Penn, Newton, and understood that modeling was an art form, not just pretty girls in pretty clothes. "Do you really think I could?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the orchestra that Charles had flown in from Vienna specifically for their wedding. "I don't think I know," Charles replied, spinning her gracefully under the ballroom's magnificent crystal chandelier. "I have connections with Ford models, IMG, Elite. Next, one phone call from me, and they'll see what I see. Absolute perfection. The camera loves symmetry, and your face is mathematical poetry. Those cheekbones could cut glass, and your eyes—" He paused, studying her face like he was memorizing every detail. "Your eyes tell stories. That's what separates real models from pretty girls. The ability to convey emotion, to sell dreams." "Promise me," she said, looking up into his confident brown eyes that seemed to hold all the certainty in the world. "Promise me you'll help me try. I promise, my beautiful wife. The world will see what I see. Give me a year to get my new development project settled. The Tribeca Tower is going to be the most exclusive residential building in the city, and then we'll make you a star. I'm talking covers, campaigns, runways. The whole world will know the name Amelia Washington." The reception continued until nearly midnight, with toasts from Manhattan's power brokers and society mavens. Charles's business partner, Robert Sterling, a man whose own real estate fortune rivaled Charles's, raised his glass of Dom Perignon 1996 and declared, "To Charles and Amelia, may your marriage be as successful as Charles's business empire and as beautiful as his bride." The crowd of 300 guests, politicians, celebrities, old money families and new money moguls, raised their glasses in a toast that echoed through the ballroom like a blessing. Amelia felt surrounded by possibility, by people who could open doors she'd never even known existed. The honeymoon in the Maldives was pure magic. Private beaches where the sand was so white it seemed to glow. Overwater bungalows that felt like floating palaces, and endless conversations about their future. Charles photographed Amelia constantly with his professional-grade Canon, telling her he was documenting her natural beauty for the portfolio they'd create together. He had an eye for composition, for lighting, for capturing her best angles. The photos were stunning, artistic, sophisticated, the kind of images that belonged in galleries rather than family albums. "See how the camera loves you?" he said, showing her the images on the camera's LCD screen as they sat on their private deck, watching the sunset paint the Indian Ocean in shades of gold and crimson. "You're a natural. We're going to take New York by storm. I'm thinking we start with some test shoots, build a portfolio, then I'll make some calls. By this time next year, you'll be booking major campaigns." The first year of marriage flew by in a whirlwind of charity galas, society events, and Charles's business dinners. Amelia played the perfect wife, looking stunning in designer gowns, Valentino, Oscar de la Renta, Carolina Herrera, and making intelligent conversation with clients and investors. She learned the art of being charming without being threatening, beautiful without being intimidating, present without being the center of attention. But whenever she brought up the modeling promises, Charles would kiss her forehead and say, "Soon, darling. Just let me close this next deal. The Tribeca project is taking all my focus, but once it's finished, we'll have all the time in the world for your career." Years 2 and 3 brought more of the same. The penthouse overlooking Central Park became their primary residence, decorated with Amelia's impeccable taste and Charles's unlimited budget. Italian marble in the foyer, French furniture in the living room, a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a five-star restaurant. She began to feel like a beautiful accessory in his life, someone to look gorgeous at events and make other men envious of Charles's good fortune. By year 5, Amelia had stopped bringing up modeling altogether. Charles seemed to have forgotten his promises entirely, too consumed with his expanding empire to remember the dreams he'd once encouraged. When she tried to mention agencies or photo shoots, his response was always the same. "Not right now, Amelia. The timing isn't right. Maybe next year when things settle down." The charity work became her outlet, organizing galas for the Metropolitan Museum, serving on the board of a children's literacy foundation, hosting fundraising dinners for causes that mattered to her. But even these accomplishments felt hollow, like she was playing a role rather than living a life. Now, 10 years later, Amelia stood in the same Plaza Hotel where they'd celebrated their wedding, but this time she was alone. The rain drummed against the windows of the empty ballroom as she remembered that first dance, those golden promises, the dreams that had slowly died like flowers without water. The room looked smaller somehow, less magical, like returning to a childhood home and realizing it wasn't the palace you remembered. She pulled her worn Burberry coat tighter, a coat that had once been the height of luxury, but now felt like a costume from a play she no longer wanted to perform in, and stared at her reflection in the ballroom's mirrors. The woman looking back was still beautiful, high cheekbones that could cut glass, full lips that curved naturally into a smile even when she wasn't happy, and those same expressive brown eyes that had captivated Charles. But the light had dimmed, replaced by something harder, more guarded, like a flame that had learned to burn smaller to avoid being extinguished. Her phone buzzed with a text that made her stomach drop. "Charles." "Where are you?" his message read, the words appearing on her screen with an urgency that suggested he was angry about something. "We need to discuss something important. Come home immediately. I'm at the plaza, remembering." "Remembering what?" "Promises," she typed back, the word feeling heavy with the weight of a decade's worth of broken dreams. The line went silent for a long moment. Then, "Come home, Amelia." Now this isn't a request. The drive through Manhattan's evening traffic gave her time to think, to watch the city lights blur past like the years that had somehow slipped away while she wasn't paying attention. 10 years of soon and maybe next year, and when the timing is right. 10 years of watching other women her age grace magazine covers while she played the perfect society wife, attending other people's triumphs and celebrating other people's dreams. The penthouse's marble foyer felt cold when she entered, despite the expensive heating system that kept every room at the perfect temperature. Charles was waiting in the living room that had been featured in Architectural Digest, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand and a manila envelope on the Italian marble coffee table between the facing sofas they'd chosen together at a showroom in Milan. "Sit down," he said without looking up from his phone, his voice carrying the tone he used with subordinates and employees. Amelia remained standing, something inside her rebelling against the command. "What's this about, Charles?" He finally looked at her, and something in his expression made her stomach drop. It was the look he gave failed business deals and disappointing investments, the look she'd seen him use to dismiss contractors and fire employees. "I think we both know this marriage has run its course," he said, gesturing to the envelope with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "My lawyers have prepared everything. The settlement is generous, more than generous, considering you signed a prenup." The words hit her like physical blows, each one landing with the force of a decade's worth of accumulated disappointments. "Charles, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that we want different things, Amelia. You're still living in some fantasy world where you think you can be a model. It's honestly become embarrassing." "Embarrassing?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 10 years of silent disappointments. My friends ask about your little hobby. My business associates wonder why my wife is still talking about modeling at 32. Robert Sterling's wife mentioned it at the club last week, asked if you were still pursuing that modeling thing. It reflects poorly on both of us. Amelia sank onto the Italian leather sofa they'd chosen together at a showroom in Soho 5 years ago, the cushions soft and expensive and completely unable to cushion the blow of his words. The envelope sat between them like evidence of her failures, like proof that she'd never been enough. 10 years, Charles, she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. 10 years of believing in your promises, 10 years of waiting for the right time that never came. He stood, straightening his Hermes tie, a tie she'd given him for their 5th anniversary, back when she still believed in their future together. Then maybe it's time you learned that some dreams have expiration dates. What secrets lay hidden in those divorce papers? And why was Charles so eager to destroy the woman he'd once promised to make a star? Chapter 2. The Cruel Truth. The morning sun, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Central Park West penthouse, had never felt more like a spotlight illuminating every crack in Amelia's carefully constructed life. She sat curled in the window seat where she'd spent countless mornings over the past decade, sipping coffee and watching the city wake up below her. From this height, Manhattan looked like a toy city, with tiny people hurrying to important jobs and meaningful lives, while she remained suspended 30 floors above it all, untouchable and untouched. The view had cost Charles $8 million, he'd reminded her often enough, a price that seemed cheap compared to what it had actually cost her. The divorce papers lay scattered across the coffee table like the remnants of a life she'd never really lived. Each page outlined the systematic dismantling of their marriage, division of assets, spousal support, custody of nothing because they'd never had children. Charles had said they should wait until her modeling phase was over, until she was ready to focus on being a mother, another delay that had stretched into eternity. Charles emerged from his home office, already dressed in a charcoal Armani suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His cufflinks, a wedding gift from her, crafted by Cartier, caught the morning light as he moved through their open-plan living space with the confident stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He poured himself coffee from the French press their housekeeper, Maria, had prepared before disappearing into the service areas where staff were meant to remain invisible. "I've scheduled the movers for Thursday," he said without preamble, his tone identical to the one he used when dictating instructions to his assistant. "The studio apartment in the village is adequate for your needs. 1 bedroom, decent natural light, close to the subway. The lease is paid for 6 months. Consider it a wedding gift." "A wedding gift?" Amelia's voice was hoarse from a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling of their master bedroom, trying to understand how 10 years of marriage could be reduced to legal documents and real estate arrangements. "Charles, we've been married for 10 years. 10 years of my life. And what exactly did you contribute during those 10 years? He turned to face her, and she saw a stranger where her husband used to be. The man who'd whispered sweet promises during their first dance had been replaced by someone cold, calculating, devoid of the warmth she'd once believed was real. "I built an empire. I created jobs for hundreds of people. I contributed to this city's economy, its development, its future. You attended charity luncheons and looked pretty at dinner parties." The cruelty in his voice was something new, or perhaps something she'd been too naive or too hopeful to notice before. This wasn't the passionate anger of a lover. This was the cold dismissal of an employer terminating an unsatisfactory employee. "I contributed my youth," she said, standing to face him, feeling the silk of her pajamas, La Perla, another expensive thing that had never made her feel valuable, against her skin. "I contributed my dreams. I contributed my belief in us, in the future you promised we'd build together." Charles laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or recognition of shared history. Your dreams? Amelia, do you even hear yourself? You're 32 years old, talking about becoming a model like you're some 18-year-old, fresh off a bus from Ohio with stars in her eyes and no understanding of how the world actually works. You promised me. I promised you a lot of things, he interrupted, moving to the floor-to-ceiling window that showcased his view of Central Park, a view that cost him $8 million and reminded him daily of his success. In the morning light, his reflection overlapped with the city below, making him look like a god surveying his domain. I promised you'd be happy as my wife. I promised you'd enjoy the lifestyle I could provide. I promised you'd want for nothing. I kept those promises. But you said you'd help me model. You said you had connections, that you'd make calls. I said what I needed to say to marry the most beautiful woman at Columbia University. His smile was cold, calculating, the expression of a man revealing a successful con. But there's a difference between beautiful enough to be a trophy wife and beautiful enough to be a model, Amelia. A very significant difference that apparently I need to explain to you like you're a child. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like she was standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. What are you saying? I'm saying I've been to Milan Fashion Week 3 times for business, real estate connections, investment opportunities. I've been to Paris, to London, to every major fashion capital. I've seen actual models, Amelia, real ones. Giselle Bündchen, Naomi Campbell, Tyra Banks, Kate Moss, women who have something you'll never have, no matter how much you want it. Which is relevance. The word hit like a physical slap, sharp and stinging and designed to wound. The modeling industry isn't a charity case for bored housewives having midlife crises. It's a business, a ruthless, unforgiving business that chews up and spits out girls half your age who are twice as qualified and 3 times as desperate. Amelia felt something break inside her chest, but instead of shattering completely, she felt something else, a spark of anger she hadn't experienced in years, hot and clean and entirely her own. You're cruel, she said quietly, the words carrying more power than if she'd screamed them. I'm realistic, Charles replied, straightening his tie in the reflection of the window. I'm doing you a favor by being honest instead of letting you continue this embarrassing charade. Look at your face, Amelia. Really look. He gestured toward the mirror that hung above their white marble fireplace, a mirror that had reflected 10 years of hope, disappointment, and now devastation. Those lines around your eyes from 10 years of disappointment, the way you've let yourself go since we stopped hosting dinner parties regularly, the sagging confidence that shows in every photograph, every public appearance. You photograph like a woman who's given up on herself. He turned from the window, and his expression was almost pitying, like he was explaining basic mathematics to a slow child. Who exactly do you think would want you as a model? Victoria's Secret? They'd escort you out of the building before you finished introducing yourself. They're looking for 19-year-olds with perfect skin and no stretch marks. Vogue? Anna Wintour would laugh at your portfolio if you even managed to get past her assistant, which you wouldn't. Harper's Bazaar? Please, they have their pick of the world's most beautiful women. What could you possibly offer that they can't get from someone younger, fresher, more relevant? Each magazine name felt like another nail in the coffin of her dreams, each dismissal a small death of the future she'd imagined. You don't even belong in the shadow of real models, Charles continued, his voice gaining momentum like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument to a jury he knew he'd already convinced. You're a pretty woman who married well. That's your achievement. That's your ceiling. And honestly, at 32, even that window is closing. How many more years do you think you have before younger, prettier wives replace you in the social hierarchy? Amelia walked to the mirror that had witnessed so many moments of their marriage, getting ready for galas, adjusting jewelry before dinner parties, practicing smiles for charity events. The woman looking back did have lines around her eyes, faint but visible in the harsh morning light. Her skin wasn't as tight as it had been at 22. Her hair wasn't as shiny as it used to be, despite the expensive treatments and professional styling. But there was something else in that reflection, something Charles couldn't see because he'd never really looked at her, only at what she represented to his image, his status, his idea of the perfect wife. "Maybe you're right," she said softly, her voice barely audible but carrying an undercurrent that Charles missed entirely. Charles looked satisfied, like he'd just closed a particularly challenging deal and secured terms heavily in his favor. Finally, some sense. "Maybe I'm not model material," Amelia continued, still looking at her reflection, seeing past the lines and the disappointments to something deeper, something that had been buried but not destroyed. "Maybe I am too old, too naive, too damaged by 10 years of believing in promises that were never meant to be kept." "Exactly," Charles said, checking his Patek Philippe watch, another symbol of his success. Another reminder of how much he'd achieved while she'd achieved nothing. "I'm glad we can finally be honest about this." Amelia turned from the mirror to face him, and something in her expression made him pause, though he couldn't quite identify what had changed. "But maybe, Charles, you're just a small man who gets off on making others feel small. Maybe you married me because you needed someone beautiful enough to make other men jealous, but not confident enough to threaten your control or overshadow your accomplishments." The silence that followed was electric, charged with 10 years of unspoken truths. "Maybe," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "you never intended to keep those promises because my success would have diminished your power over me. Maybe you needed me to stay dependent, to stay grateful, to stay small enough that I'd never realize I could leave." Charles's jaw tightened, and for the first time in their conversation, he looked uncertain. "Careful, Amelia." "Or what? You'll divorce me? Take away the pretty cage you've kept me in for 10 years? She gestured around the penthouse that had never really felt like home, just an expensive museum where she was both the curator and the most prized exhibit. "You've already done that." "You have no idea what you're giving up," Charles said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "This lifestyle, this security, this social position, you'll never have any of it again. You'll be nothing without me." "Maybe," Amelia said, walking toward the door of what had been their shared bedroom for the last time. "But nothing sounds better than being something I never was." That night, alone in the guest bedroom she'd been sleeping in for the past 6 months, Amelia sat on the floor of her walk-in closet, surrounded by a decade's worth of designer gowns she'd worn to other people's events, celebrating other people's achievements. Valentino, Oscar de la Renta, Carolina Herrera. Beautiful dresses that had made her look the part of Charles's perfect wife, but had never made her feel like herself. In the back corner, behind a row of shoes she'd never worn, Louboutins and Manolos that had seemed essential at the time, but now looked like artifacts from someone else's life, she found something she'd hidden away years ago. A white leather portfolio from her college photography classes, wrapped in tissue paper like a sacred relic. Her hands trembled as she opened it, afraid of what she might find, afraid of what she might remember. The photographs were stunning, black and white portraits of her classmates, herself, professors, raw, honest images that captured something beyond surface prettiness. There was one series she'd titled Beauty in Truth, unfiltered images that showed people in moments of genuine emotion, real vulnerability, authentic humanity. One photo stopped her breath completely. It was her, age 21, laughing at something behind the camera. Her head was thrown back, her eyes crinkled with genuine joy, her smile so radiant it seemed to light up the entire frame. The image radiated confidence, life, possibility. The woman in that photograph believed in herself, believed in the future, believed in her own infinite worth. When had she stopped being that woman? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. Unknown number. She stared at it for a long moment, wondering who could be calling at nearly midnight. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to curl up with her old photographs and mourn the woman she used to be. But something, instinct, hope, desperation, made her answer. "Hello? Amelia Washington." The voice was warm, professional, with a hint of nervousness that made it somehow familiar, like an echo from a life she'd almost forgotten. "Yes?" "This is Richard Sterling. We knew each other at Columbia." How did someone from her past find her? And what could they possibly want with the broken woman she'd become? Chapter 3. An Unexpected Ally. The name Richard Sterling hit Amelia like a time capsule exploding in her chest, flooding her with memories she'd buried under a decade of designer dinners and society expectations. Richard Sterling. Tall, lanky, always carrying a vintage Nikon camera. While she'd been part of Columbia's social elite, sorority president, dean's list, Richard had been the quiet observer in their shared art classes, capturing moments when people thought no one was watching. "Richard," she sat up straighter. "How did you find my number?" "LinkedIn, actually," he said, and she could hear the slight smile in his voice. Though it took detective work to get past Mrs. Charles Blackstone to find Amelia Washington. "I couldn't sleep after seeing the news." "The news?" "About your divorce. It was mentioned in the Post's society section." His voice softened. "I know it's probably difficult, but I had to reach out." Even her personal pain had become fodder for gossip columns. "I have a proposition for you," Richard continued. "Would you be willing to meet for coffee? There's something I'd like to discuss." "Richard, I don't think—" "Please, just coffee. 1 hour." 3 days later, Amelia found herself walking through Soho's cobblestone streets. She'd changed outfits 4 times, finally settling on a simple black dress and her grandmother's pearls. The cafe was tucked between an art gallery and vintage bookstore, the kind of place she never would have chosen during her marriage to Charles. She spotted Richard immediately. The awkward college boy had transformed into a confident man in his mid-30s. He wore dark jeans and a charcoal cashmere sweater. His green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses were exactly as she remembered. But it was what he held that made her breath catch, a single white rose. "You always loved these," he said, standing as she approached. "From Professor Martinez's garden behind the Fine Arts Building, you used to photograph them, roses growing wild, finding ways to bloom despite being ignored." The memory hit like a physical force. Those roses had been her favorite subject junior year. "You remember that?" she asked, accepting the rose. "I remember everything about those photography classes," Richard said, "especially the way you saw beauty where others only saw ordinary things." A server appeared. "What can I get you to?" "Just coffee," Amelia said. "Black." "Make that 2, Richard added. "You look exactly the same." "I don't feel like the same person." "That's why I wanted to see you." Richard leaned forward. "I know about Charles. I know about the promises he made and didn't fulfill." Amelia's defenses went up. "If this is pity, it's opportunity." He placed a business card on the table. "Sterling Vision Photography and Talent Agency." "I started this agency 5 years ago," Richard explained. "We specialize in finding authentic beauty, real women with real stories." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs of models, women in their 30s, 40s, even 50s, all stunning, with presence and confidence. "The industry is changing," Richard said. "Brands want authenticity, real women who represent their actual clientele." One photograph caught her attention, a black woman her age modeling for luxury skincare. "This is Nia Williams," Richard said. "Former schoolteacher, started modeling at 35. Now, she's one of the most sought-after models in New York. Why are you showing me this? Because I want to sign you, Richard said simply. I want to give you everything Charles promised and more. Why me? Richard was quiet for a moment, color rising in his cheeks. Professionally, you have something the camera will love. Bone structure photographers dream about. He paused. Personally, I've been waiting 15 years to tell you that you were always the most beautiful woman in any room. I built this agency hoping someday I'd get the chance to remind you who you really were. I don't know if I can trust another man's promises, she said quietly. Then don't trust my promises, Richard replied. Trust your own power. Trust the woman who photographed wild roses because she understood that extraordinary things often grow in unexpected places. What would this involve? Test shots to build a portfolio, training with movement coaches, stylists. We start small and build from there. And if I'm not good enough? Then we find out together. But Amelia, you are good enough. You always were. As they left the cafe, Amelia clutched the white rose and Richard's business card. For the first time in years, she felt hope. But her phone buzzed with a text from Charles. Heard you were seen having coffee with some photographer. Don't embarrass yourself further. People are watching. How had Charles found out about their meeting so quickly? And what lengths would he go to stop her from reclaiming her dreams? Chapter 4. Walls of Distrust. The text message from Charles felt like ice water in Amelia's veins, transforming her tentative hope back into familiar fear as she stood on the cobblestone streets of Soho with Richard beside her. She stared at her phone screen as Richard hailed a taxi, her hands trembling slightly as she read the message again. Heard you were seen having coffee with some photographer. Don't embarrass yourself further, people are watching. How had he found out so quickly? They'd been careful, meeting at an obscure cafe in Soho that Charles would never frequent, a neighborhood he'd always dismissed as trying too hard to be artistic. But somehow, in a city of 8 million people, her ex-husband's network of eyes and ears had spotted her the moment she'd dared to step outside the boundaries he'd drawn around her life. It was like being trapped in a fishbowl, every movement monitored and reported back to her captor. Everything okay? Richard asked, noticing her expression as a yellow cab pulled to the curb, its driver already looking impatient with the midday traffic. Charles knows, she said simply, showing him the text with a hand that shook despite her efforts to appear calm. Richard's jaw tightened as he read the message, his green eyes darkening with an anger she hadn't seen from him before. How the hell? He stopped himself, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that made him look younger, more vulnerable. I'm sorry, Amelia. I should have thought about this. Charles has connections everywhere in Manhattan. Real estate developers know everyone, restaurateurs, shop owners, society photographers who probably have standing orders to report back on his wife's activities. Maybe this was a mistake, she said, stepping back from the taxi, her old fears rushing back with the force of a tidal wave. Maybe I should just, hey. Richard's voice was gentle but firm, and he moved to block her path without being threatening. Look at me. When she met his eyes, she saw something she'd forgotten existed. Genuine concern without condescension, support without strings attached. Charles Blackstone doesn't own the sidewalks of New York, Richard said, his voice carrying a quiet strength that reminded her why she'd been drawn to his confidence in college. He doesn't own your right to have coffee with an old friend, and he sure as hell doesn't own your dreams. But he has power. He has money, Richard corrected, very different from real power. Real power comes from talent, from authenticity, from being undeniable. And you, Amelia Washington, have the potential to be completely undeniable. That night, Amelia sat in the sterile guest bedroom of the penthouse, staring at Richard's business card while the city sparkled 30 floors below her. The apartment felt like a museum of her marriage, beautiful, expensive, and completely devoid of life. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every carefully chosen accent piece reflected Charles's taste, his vision, his world. The Rothko in the dining room that cost more than most people's houses, the Italian marble that required special cleaning products, the fresh flowers that Maria arranged twice weekly, all of it beautiful, all of it meaningless. She'd never realized how little of herself existed in this space until now, how completely she'd been erased from her own life. Her phone rang, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. "Charles, we need to talk," he said without preamble when she answered, his voice carrying that dangerous edge she'd learned to recognize over the years. "About what?" "About your little coffee date with some wannabe photographer. About the fact that you're apparently determined to humiliate yourself, and by extension me, in front of all of Manhattan. Charles, we're getting divorced. What I do with my time is no longer your concern. Everything you do reflects on me until those papers are signed." His voice was cold, controlled, the tone he used in hostile business negotiations. "And I won't have my soon-to-be ex-wife making a fool of herself with some nobody who's clearly taking advantage of your emotional state." "Taking advantage?" Amelia stood, pacing to the window that overlooked the city where her dreams had been born and buried. "Maybe someone is finally offering to help me achieve something I've wanted my entire adult life." Christ, Amelia, listen to yourself. You're 32 years old, talking about modeling like you're some teenager with stars in her eyes and no understanding of how the world actually works. It's pathetic. The word hit like a physical blow, sharp and designed to wound. But instead of crumbling, Amelia felt something harden inside her, something that had been forged in the fire of 10 years of systematic diminishment. "You know what's pathetic, Charles? A man who marries a woman with dreams and spends 10 years systematically destroying her confidence so she'll never leave. A man who gets off on being the smartest person in the room, even if that means making everyone else feel stupid." The silence on the other end was telling, pregnant with 10 years of unspoken truths. "I'm going to Sterling Vision tomorrow," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm going to do a test shoot." "Like hell you are! Try to stop me." She hung up before he could respond. The first time in 10 years she'd ended a conversation with Charles on her terms. Sterling Vision Photography occupied the top 2 floors of a converted warehouse in Tribeca, accessible only by a freight elevator that opened directly into the studio space. The building itself was a testament to New York's ability to reinvent itself. What had once been an industrial space for manufacturing was now home to artists, photographers, and creative agencies that shaped the city's cultural landscape. The moment Amelia stepped inside, she felt like she'd entered a different world entirely. The main studio was flooded with natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Hudson River, where tugboats and barges moved like toys on a child's play set. The exposed brick walls were covered with stunning photographs, not the glossy, over-retouched images she associated with fashion photography, but raw, powerful portraits that seemed to breathe with life. "Welcome to my playground," Richard said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee in handmade ceramic mugs that looked like they'd been crafted by local artisans. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it completely. The space felt alive with creativity, with possibility, with the kind of authentic artistic energy she'd forgotten existed. "It feels like art is actually created here, not just manufactured." "That's the idea." He led her through the space, pointing out different areas with the pride of someone who'd built something meaningful with his own hands. The main shooting area, with its array of professional lighting equipment that looked both high-tech and surprisingly elegant. A makeup station that looked like something from a high-end salon, complete with professional mirrors surrounded by Hollywood-style bulbs. A wardrobe area filled with clothes that looked expensive but not flashy, sophisticated rather than trendy. "This is Sarah Goldman," Richard said, introducing her to a woman in her 40s with sharp black hair cut in a geometric bob and an even sharper eye for style. She wore all black, simple, elegant, expensive, and assessed Amelia with the kind of professional evaluation that felt thorough without being judgmental. "She's our head stylist, and the reason half my models look like they stepped out of Vogue." "The secret," Sarah said, looking Amelia up and down with the clinical precision of a doctor examining a patient, "is finding clothes that love the woman, not trying to make the woman fit the clothes. Most stylists have it backwards. They try to force bodies into fashion instead of finding fashion that celebrates bodies." "And this is Marcus Chen," Richard continued, gesturing to a tall Asian man with the build of a dancer and the energy of someone who genuinely loved his work. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who understood his body completely, every gesture deliberate and beautiful. Movement coach, former dancer with the New York City Ballet. He teaches models how to inhabit their bodies like queens. "Modeling isn't about being pretty," Marcus said, shaking Amelia's hand with a grip that was both gentle and surprisingly strong, speaking with the authority of someone who understood physicality at the highest level. "It's about owning your space, commanding attention through presence rather than desperation. Everything else, the clothes, the makeup, the lighting, is just decoration." As they prepared for the test shoot, Amelia felt her anxiety mounting like a tide, threatening to drown her. What if Charles was right? What if she really was delusional? What if the camera revealed every flaw, every line, every year that had passed since she'd last believed in herself? What if she was just another desperate housewife chasing impossible dreams? "I can't do this," she said, as Sarah approached with a selection of outfits draped over her arm like possibilities made tangible. This was a mistake. "What specifically can't you do?" Richard asked, setting down his camera and giving her his complete attention. I don't know how to model. I don't know how to pose, how to move, how to be whatever it is you need me to be. I'm not 19 anymore. I'm not fresh. I'm not—" "Then don't be anything except yourself," Richard said simply, his voice cutting through her spiral of self-doubt. "Sarah, let's start with something simple, something that makes her feel confident." Sarah selected a flowing white blouse and dark jeans. Nothing fancy, nothing that screamed fashion shoot, but clothes that fit Amelia's body perfectly and made her feel like an elevated version of herself rather than a costume she was wearing. The makeup artist, a gentle woman named Lisa, with intricate tattoos covering her arms like living art, worked magic without making Amelia look like someone else. "We're just enhancing what's already there," she explained, as she worked with brushes that felt like feathers against Amelia's skin. "Your bone structure is incredible. Your skin is beautiful. We're just making sure the camera sees what I see, what anyone with eyes should see." When Amelia looked in the mirror, she saw herself, but somehow more. The woman looking back had presence, confidence, a glow that seemed to come from within rather than from the professional lighting and expertly applied makeup. "Ready?" Richard asked, adjusting his camera settings with the precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting his craft. She nodded, though her heart was racing like she was about to jump out of an airplane. The first few shots were awkward. Amelia felt stiff, unnatural, hyper-aware of every angle and expression. She could hear Charles's voice in her head, telling her she was foolish, pathetic, too old for this kind of fantasy. But Richard worked patiently, talking her through each pose, making gentle adjustments, telling stories that made her laugh despite her nerves. "Tell me about your favorite photograph you ever took," he said, as he continued shooting, his voice warm and encouraging. "There was this series I did senior year," Amelia said, relaxing slightly as she remembered a time when she'd believed in her own artistic vision. "Street musicians in Washington Square Park. but not performing, just in the quiet moments between songs, when they thought no one was watching. What did you love about those shots? The honesty, she said without thinking, and something in her expression shifted as she remembered what it felt like to capture truth. They weren't performing for the camera, they were just real, authentic, themselves. Exactly, Richard said, and she heard the camera clicking more rapidly, capturing something she didn't even realize she was giving him. That's what I want from you, not performance, truth. Gradually, Amelia began to relax. She stopped thinking about her angles and started responding to Richard's direction, to the music playing softly in the background, to the way the afternoon light moved across her face like a caress. She found herself moving more naturally, smiling more genuinely, accessing something she'd forgotten she possessed. "There she is," Richard murmured at one point, and something in his voice made her look directly into the camera with an expression of genuine joy, pure and unguarded. When he finally stopped shooting and showed her the images on his camera's LCD screen, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photographs was luminous, confident, beautiful in a way that seemed to radiate from within rather than being applied from without. She had presence, grace, an indefinable quality that made it impossible to look away. "That's not me," she whispered, staring at the image that seemed to show a different person entirely. "That's exactly you," Richard said, his voice gentle but firm. "That's who you've always been, Amelia. You just forgot for a while." As they wrapped up the shoot, Amelia felt something she hadn't experienced in years, pride in herself. Not pride in her appearance or her clothes or the man on her arm, but pride in her own capability, her own potential, her own worth as a human being separate from anyone else's opinion. But as she gathered her things to leave, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Mrs. Blackstone. The voice was professional, official, carrying the weight of authority. "This is Detective Rivera with the NYPD. We need to speak with you about some threats that have been made against a Richard Sterling. Your name came up in our investigation." "What kind of threats? And how far would Charles go to stop her from reclaiming her dreams?" Chapter 5. The transformation begins. The police station on East 51st Street smelled like burnt coffee and broken dreams. Detective Rivera led Amelia to a small interview room with fluorescent lighting. "Mrs. Blackstone, we received a report about harassment and potential threats against Richard Sterling. Your ex-husband's name came up." Amelia's stomach dropped. "What kind of threats?" "Someone called Mr. Sterling's business line multiple times, claiming he was taking advantage of emotionally vulnerable women and threatening to expose his operation. The caller also made vague threats about making sure he couldn't prey on anyone else." "And you think it was Charles?" "The calls came from a blocked number, but Mr. Sterling mentioned you'd recently been contacted by your ex-husband." After giving her statement and learning the police couldn't do much about vague threats, Amelia found herself outside the precinct feeling alone. Her phone had 17 missed calls from Charles. "We need to talk. Now. This is getting out of hand. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." Instead of going home, she took the subway to Tribeca. She found Richard reviewing the previous day's photos. Seeing the images again made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "The police called me," she said. Richard looked up. "I know. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. I'm sorry I brought this into your life. Charles isn't used to not getting his way." "This isn't your fault, Amelia. Rich men who threaten people who help their ex-wives, that's not your responsibility." "But maybe he's right. Maybe I'm being foolish, chasing dreams that should have died years ago." Richard moved to the chair across from her. "Look at me. Yesterday, you stepped in front of my camera and became exactly what I knew you could be. Those photographs aren't the result of good lighting. They're the result of your natural talent, your beauty that comes from somewhere deeper than skin. But Charles has connections, power, and I have something he doesn't. I have talent, integrity, and 15 years of building a reputation based on finding real beauty in real women. Over the next 3 weeks, despite Charles's continued threats, Amelia threw herself into transformation. She moved into a small studio apartment in the village, nothing like the luxury she was accustomed to. But it was hers. The apartment was tiny but charming, with exposed brick walls and windows overlooking a tree-lined street. For the first time in years, Amelia felt like she could breathe. Marcus Chen became her movement coach, working with her 3 times a week. Modeling isn't about being thin, Marcus explained. It's about owning your space, moving with intention, commanding attention through presence. Learning to walk properly took weeks, not the careful steps she'd perfected as Charles's wife, but the confident stride of a woman who belonged wherever she was walking. Sarah Goldman worked with her on style, focusing on clothes that enhanced Amelia's natural elegance. Fashion should serve the woman, not the other way around, Sarah explained. We're choosing clothes that celebrate your body instead of hiding it. The most surprising part was working with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a therapist specializing in emotional abuse recovery. 10 years of someone telling you that you're not enough leaves marks, Dr. Walsh explained. We need to rebuild your confidence from the inside out. The therapy sessions were harder than the physical training. Confronting how Charles had systematically undermined her self-worth, recognizing patterns of control and manipulation, it was exhausting work. But slowly, something began to change. Amelia started sleeping better, eating foods she actually enjoyed, buying white roses for her apartment. The breakthrough came during her 4th week of training. Richard was photographing her for her portfolio, and something clicked. Instead of thinking about angles, Amelia simply existed in front of the camera, confident in her own skin. Perfect, Richard murmured. That's exactly it. When he showed her the results, Amelia saw a woman she barely recognized, not because she looked different, but because she looked like herself. I want to submit these to Elena Rodriguez at Radiance Cosmetics, Richard said. They're launching a campaign focused on women over 30. That evening, walking home through the village, she felt excitement about the future. The city lights seemed brighter, possibilities endless. But when she reached her building, Charles was waiting by the entrance, his expensive car idling at the curb. We need to talk, he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge she'd never heard before. What was Charles planning now? And how far would he go to destroy the new life she was building? Chapter 6. Rising Star. Charles looked out of place on the tree-lined street in the village, his $1,000 shoes and tailored coat a stark contrast to the bohemian atmosphere of her new neighborhood, where artists and writers and dreamers could still afford to live. "Get in the car, Amelia," he said, his voice carrying the tone he'd once used to summon her to dinner parties where she was expected to smile and look beautiful while he conducted business with men who never bothered to learn her name. "No," she said simply, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice, the way the word felt solid and uncompromising in her mouth. "Excuse me." "I said no, Charles. We have nothing to discuss." His eyes narrowed, and she saw something she'd never noticed before, or perhaps something she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Behind the confident facade was something smaller, more desperate, like a child who'd never been told he couldn't have something he wanted. "We have plenty to discuss, starting with the fact that you've lost your mind and are embarrassing both of us with this ridiculous modeling fantasy. The only thing ridiculous here is you showing up at my apartment like you have any right to tell me how to live my life." A few passers-by slowed their pace, sensing tension with the urban dweller's instinct for avoiding trouble. Charles noticed and lowered his voice, but his words became more venomous, like poison concentrated to be more deadly. You think you're being brave, Amelia. You think this little rebellion makes you strong. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of expensive scotch on his breath, the kind that cost more per bottle than most people made in a week. You're still the same insecure little girl who needed my validation to feel worthy. The only difference is now you're getting that validation from some second-rate photographer who's clearly taking advantage of your mental breakdown. Richard isn't taking advantage of anyone. Richard, Charles repeated with disgust, like the name tasted bitter in his mouth. Do you have any idea who this man really is? Have you bothered to research his background, his client list, his reputation, or were you too desperate for attention to ask basic questions? Despite her newfound confidence, Amelia felt a flicker of doubt, small but sharp. She realized she knew very little about Richard's business beyond what he'd told her, had trusted based on feeling rather than fact. Charles saw the uncertainty in her expression and smiled coldly, like a predator that had detected weakness in its prey. I thought not. Richard Sterling has a very interesting history, Amelia. A pattern of discovering vulnerable women and promising them modeling careers that never materialize. Most of them end up broke and humiliated when reality sets in. You're lying. Am I? Why don't you ask him about Melissa Crawford, or Jessica Torres, or any of the other desperate housewives who thought he was their ticket to stardom? Charles's voice grew more confident as he delivered information he'd clearly researched with the thoroughness of a prosecutor building a case. I have documentation, Amelia. Photos, financial records, testimonials from women who trusted him and lived to regret it. Charles's driver got out of the car and opened the rear door, a choreographed movement that spoke of years of practice. I'll give you 24 hours to come to your senses, Charles said, walking toward the vehicle with the confidence of a man who'd never been truly denied anything he wanted. After that, I start making phone calls, to clients, to agencies, to anyone who might consider working with your precious Richard. I have the power to destroy his career, Amelia. Don't make me use it. The car pulled away, leaving Amelia standing on the sidewalk, feeling like she'd been hit by a truck. The confidence she'd built over the past few weeks felt fragile suddenly, like a house of cards that could collapse with one wrong breath. That night, Amelia lay awake in her small apartment, Charles's words echoing in her mind like a broken record. She'd felt so confident, so sure of herself and of Richard's intentions. But what if Charles was right? What if she was just another delusional woman chasing impossible dreams, too blinded by attention to see she was being manipulated? She found herself Googling Richard's name at 2 a.m., searching for information about his previous clients with the desperation of someone who needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. The search results were frustratingly vague, successful campaigns with various agencies but no detailed client histories. No mention of the women Charles had named, no scandal or controversy that would suggest predatory behavior. But the absence of negative information didn't necessarily mean Charles was wrong. It just meant Richard was careful, professional, good at managing his reputation. The next morning, she arrived at Sterling Vision with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered, her stomach churning with doubt and caffeine and the kind of anxiety that made everything feel slightly unreal. Richard was reviewing contact sheets when she entered, his concentration so complete that he didn't notice her until she cleared her throat. The photos spread across his desk showed models in various poses, all beautiful, all confident, all considerably younger than her. Amelia, he said, his face lighting up in a way that made her heart ache with its apparent sincerity. Perfect timing. I wanted to show you something. He handed her a printed email, the paper still warm from the printer. The subject line read, Amelia Washington Portfolio. Elena Rodriguez from Radiance Cosmetics, Richard explained, his voice excited in a way that seemed genuine but could have been performance. She wants to meet with you next week about their new campaign. This could be it, Amelia, your first major booking. Amelia stared at the email, the words blurring slightly as Charles's accusations warred with her desire to believe in this opportunity. This was what she'd dreamed of, a real chance with a major brand, validation that she was good enough to compete at the highest level. But Charles's words felt like poison in her bloodstream, contaminating everything she thought she knew. "Richard," she said carefully, her voice steadier than she felt, "can I ask you about some of your previous clients?" Something shifted in his expression, subtle but noticeable, like a door closing behind his eyes. "Of course. What would you like to know?" Charles mentioned some names. Women he said you'd worked with before who didn't succeed. Richard was quiet for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit down in one of the comfortable chairs in his office area. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured, like someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "Melissa Crawford was one of my first clients when I started the agency," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with what appeared to be genuine regret. "She was going through a difficult divorce, and I thought I could help her rebuild her confidence through modeling. But I was inexperienced, too eager to prove myself. I put her in situations she wasn't ready for, pushed too hard too fast. She ended up having a panic attack during a major shoot and quit modeling entirely." Amelia's heart sank like a stone dropped in deep water. "Jessica Torres was similar," Richard continued, his honesty feeling like knives even as she appreciated it. "I was so focused on proving my agency could succeed that I didn't pay enough attention to what my clients actually needed. I made mistakes, Amelia. I've learned from them, but I can't undo them." The honesty in his voice was devastating, confirming Charles's accusations, even as it revealed a man capable of growth and self-reflection. "So Charles was right?" "Charles was partially right," Richard said, leaning forward in his chair. "I have worked with women who weren't successful, but what he didn't tell you is why they weren't successful and what I learned from those experiences." He opened his laptop and showed her a website, not his agency's main site, but something more personal, more revealing. "After Jessica quit, I took a year off to figure out what I was doing wrong," Richard explained, his voice gaining strength as he moved into more comfortable territory. "I studied with movement coaches, worked with therapists who specialized in confidence building, learned about the psychological aspects of career transition and trauma recovery. I rebuilt my entire approach from the ground up." The website showed a different side of Sterling Vision: partnerships with therapists, career counselors, life coaches, testimonials from women who'd found success not just in modeling, but in rebuilding their entire lives after divorce, abuse, career changes, major life transitions. "I don't just take photographs anymore, Amelia. I help women remember who they are. The modeling is just one part of that process, a tool for rebuilding confidence, for reclaiming power, for proving to themselves that they're capable of more than they thought possible." As if summoned by their conversation, Richard's phone rang with the aggressive persistence of someone who wouldn't be ignored. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned, his expression darkening. "Elena Rodriguez," he said, answering with professional warmth that couldn't quite hide his concern. "Good morning." "What? When? Are you sure?" Amelia watched his expression change from confusion to anger, to something that looked like resignation mixed with fury. "I understand," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for calling to tell me personally." He hung up and turned to Amelia, his face grim with the expression of someone delivering bad news. "The Radiance campaign has been cancelled," he said, the words hitting like physical blows. "Apparently, they received some concerning information about both of us that made them reconsider their decision." Amelia's phone buzzed with a text from Charles that felt like a victory lap. 24 hours are up. This is just the beginning." The war had officially begun, and Charles had drawn first blood. But instead of feeling defeated, Amelia felt something else: fury. Pure, clean anger at a man who would destroy other people's dreams just to maintain control, who would use his power to hurt innocent people rather than accept that he couldn't own another human being. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "I know," Richard replied, his green eyes steady and determined. "He's going to try to destroy both of us." "Probably." She looked at Richard, this man who'd been honest about his failures, who'd rebuilt his entire business around helping women like her, who'd risked his reputation to give her a chance she'd never thought possible. "Then we'd better make sure we're too successful to destroy," she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd finally found something worth fighting for. But with Charles's money and connections working against them, would they be able to overcome his sabotage? And what would their fight for success cost them both? Chapter 7. Breaking Barriers. The war room that was Sterling Vision buzzed with the energy of people who refused to surrender, even when facing an enemy with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Richard had assembled what he called his crisis team: Sarah Goldman, Marcus Chen, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, and Eleanor Rodriguez's assistant, who'd secretly called to warn them about Charles's campaign against them. The group sat around Richard's conference table like generals planning a counter-offensive, surrounded by the photographs that represented everything they were fighting to protect. "He's been methodical," explained Patricia Kim, Elena's former assistant, who'd quit in protest when her boss caved to Charles's pressure. She was a young woman with sharp intelligence and the kind of moral backbone that had become rare in an industry driven by money and influence. Phone calls to every major agency, spreading rumors about financial irregularities, suggesting Richard preys on vulnerable women. "He's not making direct accusations, too smart for that. He's just raising concerns and asking questions that plant doubt." "What about the legal angle?" Dr. Walsh asked, her therapeutic training making her consider all possibilities. "This sounds like defamation, harassment, interference with business relationships." "Hard to prove," Richard replied, pacing the length of his studio with the restless energy of a caged animal. "Charles is too smart to make direct accusations. He's not saying I'm a predator, he's just wondering aloud if I might be. He's not claiming I'm financially irresponsible, he's just asking if my clients have gotten the returns they expected on their investments." Amelia sat quietly in the center of this chaos, feeling responsible for bringing destruction to people who'd only tried to help her. The guilt was overwhelming, compounded by the knowledge that Charles was doing this because she dared to dream again, dared to want something for herself. "This is my fault," she said finally, her voice cutting through the strategic discussions. "Charles is doing this because of me. Maybe I should just—" "Don't you dare," Sarah interrupted sharply, her voice carrying the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd seen too many women sacrifice themselves for male egos. "Don't you dare let that bastard win by making you blame yourself." "Sarah's right," Marcus added, his dancer's grace evident even in the way he leaned forward in his chair. "This isn't about you, Amelia. This is about a powerful man who can't handle losing control. You could disappear tomorrow, and he'd find another way to hurt people who threaten his sense of superiority." Over the next week, Charles's campaign intensified with the systematic precision of a military operation. 3 more potential clients cancelled meetings with Sterling Vision after receiving anonymous tips about the agency's practices. A gossip blogger wrote a blind item about a certain real estate mogul's ex-wife and her questionable new career choices. The harassment escalated to Richard receiving threatening phone calls at all hours, voices claiming to be concerned citizens, warning him about the consequences of exploiting vulnerable women. But something unexpected began to happen, like a grassroots movement that organizes itself around a shared injustice. Word of Charles's intimidation tactics started spreading through the fashion industry's underground network. the photographers, stylists, models, and agents who formed the real backbone of the business. They'd all experienced similar treatment from powerful men who used money as a weapon, and they recognized the pattern immediately. The first call came from Diane von Furstenberg's office, a lifeline thrown from the top of the fashion hierarchy. "Ms. von Furstenberg would like to meet with Ms. Washington," her assistant said when Richard answered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for a legend. "She's heard about the situation and finds it unacceptable." The meeting took place in DVF's showroom, surrounded by the bold prints and flowing fabrics that had made Diane a legend and a symbol of female empowerment. She was in her 70s, but radiated the energy of someone half her age, moving through her domain with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades refusing to be diminished by men who thought money made them powerful. "Darling," she said to Amelia in her distinctive accent, her hands expressive as she spoke, "I've been watching this little drama with great interest. You know, I've seen many powerful men try to silence women over the years. They never succeed in the long run because they fundamentally misunderstand where real power comes from. But Charles has so much influence." "Charles has money," Diane corrected, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd navigated decades of male-dominated industries. "Very different from power. Real power comes from being undeniable, from creating something meaningful, from inspiring others. And you, my dear, are becoming quite undeniable." She gestured to the portfolio Richard had brought, spreading the images across her conference table like tarot cards revealing a promising future. "These photographs are extraordinary. You have something that can't be bought or intimidated. Authentic beauty with real depth, the kind that comes from living, from surviving, from growing stronger." "Thank you, but I'm not sure it matters if no one will hire me." Diane smiled with the expression of someone who was about to reveal a secret. "Who said anything about being hired? What if you created your own opportunities?" That afternoon, Diane introduced them to Marc Jacobs, who was planning a campaign celebrating women over 30 for his fall collection. Then, Anna Wintour's office called personally, the fashion world's equivalent of receiving a blessing from the Pope. "Ms. Wintour doesn't appreciate men using financial leverage to silence women's voices," her assistant explained, in the carefully modulated tones of someone who spoke for the most powerful person in fashion, especially not in her industry. The momentum continued building like an avalanche gaining speed. Iman reached out through her publicist, offering support and wisdom from someone who'd broken barriers throughout her career. Lauren Hutton sent a personal note praising Amelia's courage. Christy Turlington offered to mentor her, sharing her own experiences of finding success later in her modeling career. "It's like the entire industry is rallying around you," Richard observed as they read through the messages of support that arrived daily, each one a small victory against Charles's campaign of intimidation. "It's not about me," Amelia realized, understanding something larger than her individual struggle. "It's about what I represent. Every woman who's been told she's too old, too different, not enough. Every person who's been bullied by someone with more money than character." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Patricia Mills, the head coordinator of New York Fashion Week, calling with an opportunity that could change everything. "We've been watching this situation with great interest," Patricia said during their meeting at the Fashion Week headquarters, her office walls covered with photographs from decades of shows that had shaped the industry. "We're launching a new showcase this season, Timeless Beauty, featuring models over 30. We want you to open the show." Richard nearly dropped his coffee cup, the ceramic clicking against the table. "Open? You mean lead model, opening look, prime time slot," Patricia confirmed, her voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would reverberate throughout the industry. 5 designers, all featuring women who prove that beauty doesn't expire at 25. This is our statement that fashion needs to evolve, and you're going to help us make it. New York Fashion Week. the biggest stage in fashion, where careers were made and legends were born. Opening a show would cement Amelia's credibility and launch her into the industry's highest tier, proving to everyone, including Charles, that his attempts at sabotage had failed spectacularly. But it also made her the biggest possible target for Charles's sabotage, a bullseye painted on everything she'd worked to build. "He'll try everything to stop this," Amelia said, as they walked back to Richard's studio through the bustling streets of Tribeca, past galleries and restaurants and the dreams of people who'd come to New York to make something of themselves. "Then we'll be ready for everything," Richard replied, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd found something worth fighting for. The preparation was intense, like training for the Olympics of beauty and confidence. Amelia worked with Javon Williams, a former male model who now trained fashion's biggest names, in a studio that felt like a temple to physical excellence. "Forget everything you think you know about runway walking," Javon said, during their first session in a space that smelled like ambition and determination. "The runway isn't about pretty steps or looking cute. It's about claiming your space, telling your story in 30 seconds, making everyone who sees you believe that you belong exactly where you are." Day after day, Amelia practiced with the dedication of someone who understood that this was more than just walking. It was a statement, a declaration, a refusal to be silenced. The walk, the turns, the attitude, but more importantly, she practiced believing she belonged there. "Your story," Javon explained during one particularly grueling session, sweat beading on both their foreheads as they worked under hot lights, "is about a woman who refused to be silenced. Walk like that woman. Turn like her. Own that runway like your life depends on it, because in many ways it does." The designers were instantly captivated by Amelia's transformation. Marcus Thompson, known for his empowering women's wear, fit her personally for the opening look. A stunning burgundy gown that highlighted every curve, every angle of her face, every year of experience that had brought her to this moment. "You're going to stop traffic," he said, as she stood on the fitting platform, the gown flowing around her like liquid confidence. "Charles Blackstone is going to watch this show and realize he threw away a diamond to play with costume jewelry." 2 weeks before the show, the pressure escalated beyond harassment into active sabotage. Charles's latest tactic was threatening Richard's landlord, trying to get Sterling Vision evicted from the space that had become synonymous with empowering women. When that failed, he started spreading rumors about financial irregularities in Richard's business, suggesting tax evasion and client fund mismanagement. "I can't let you destroy your life for me," Amelia said one evening as they worked late, preparing for the show that would determine both their futures. "Look at me," Richard said, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength in his fingers. "Do you know why I really started this agency?" She shook her head, though she suspected the answer would change everything between them. "Because 15 years ago, I watched the most beautiful, talented woman I'd ever known disappear into a marriage that made her smaller. I built my entire career hoping that someday I'd get the chance to remind her who she really was." He cupped her face gently, his thumbs tracing the cheekbones that had first captivated him in a college photography class. "Charles can threaten my business, my reputation, my livelihood, but he can't touch what really matters, watching you find your power again. That's worth everything I have, everything I am." The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, and full of 15 years of patience and hope and dreams, deferred but not forgotten. But their moment was interrupted by Richard's phone ringing, with the harsh insistence of bad news. The caller ID showed Patricia Mills. "Richard!" Patricia's voice was tense when he answered, like someone delivering news that would change everything. "We have a problem. Charles Blackstone has scheduled a major press conference for the same day as Fashion Week. He's calling it Exposing Predatory Practices in the Fashion Industry." With the biggest moment of her life just days away, would Charles's final gambit destroy everything they'd built? And what secret weapon did he think he had? Chapter 8. The Spotlight Beckons. The Mandarin Oriental Hotel's ballroom had been transformed into a media circus, with cameras, lights and reporters crowding every available space for Charles Blackstone's press conference that felt more like a public execution than a news event. Amelia watched the live stream from Richard's studio, her stomach churning as her ex-husband stepped up to the podium wearing his most expensive suit and an expression of manufactured concern that she now recognized as pure performance art. Behind him, a banner read, "Protecting Vulnerable Women, a Call for Industry Accountability," words that felt like a mockery of everything she'd fought to achieve. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of commanding boardrooms and intimidating rivals. "I'm here today to expose a troubling pattern of predatory behavior in the fashion industry, specifically photographers and agents who target vulnerable women going through difficult divorces." Richard's jaw clenched as Charles continued his carefully crafted character assassination, each word chosen for maximum damage with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "My soon-to-be ex-wife, Amelia, is currently being manipulated by an individual who has a documented history of taking advantage of emotionally fragile women," Charles continued, his voice taking on the tone of a concerned patriarch protecting his family. "This so-called photographer promises modeling careers that never materialize, charges exorbitant fees for training and portfolio development, and preys on women's insecurities during their most vulnerable moments." "He's good," Dr. Walsh observed grimly from her position near the monitor, her professional training allowing her to analyze Charles's technique with clinical detachment. "He's positioning himself as the concerned ex-husband trying to protect you while making Richard look like a predator. Classic manipulation. He's the hero of his own story." On screen, Charles fielded questions from reporters with practiced ease, his responses polished from years of managing his public image and controlling narratives that served his interests. "Mr. Blackstone, what evidence do you have of these practices?" asked a woman from the Post, her pen poised to capture quotable sound bites. "I have documentation of at least 6 women who have been financially and emotionally exploited by this individual over the past 5 years, Charles replied smoothly, producing a folder that looked official and damning. Women who were promised successful modeling careers and instead found themselves thousands of dollars poorer and psychologically damaged. Amelia's phone started buzzing with calls from reporters, but she ignored them all. Transfixed by the performance of the man she'd once loved, the man who was now systematically destroying her dreams, with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to building his real estate empire. "The tragic irony," Charles continued, his voice taking on a note of paternal sadness, "is that my ex-wife is a beautiful, intelligent woman who deserves better than to be someone's meal ticket. I'm speaking out not from anger or vindictiveness, but from genuine concern for her well-being and for other women who might be similarly targeted." "What a performance!" Sarah said with disgust, her hands clenched into fists as she watched Charles weave his web of lies with masterful precision. But Amelia barely heard her. She was staring at the screen, watching Charles deploy every weapon in his considerable arsenal. His money, his connections, his media savvy, his ability to present himself as the reasonable party in any conflict. He was right about one thing: he was very good at this. And the media was eating it up, hungry for a story that combined wealth, glamour, and scandal. The press conference concluded with Charles announcing that he was offering a reward for any information about other victims of this predatory behavior, effectively turning Amelia's struggle into a public spectacle and Richard into a wanted man. Within an hour, Richard's phone was ringing non-stop with reporters demanding statements. The studio's email was flooded with inquiries ranging from genuine journalism to tabloid gossip hunting. 2 clients immediately cancelled upcoming shoots, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. "We need to respond," Sarah said urgently, her strategic mind already formulating counterattacks. "No," Richard said quietly, his voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected calm. "What do you mean, no?" Marcus demanded, his dancer's precision evident even in his agitation. "He just destroyed your reputation on live television." "He tried to destroy my reputation," Richard corrected, his green eyes steady despite the storm raging around them. "There's a difference." Richard walked to his computer and pulled up an email that had arrived during the press conference, his fingers steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. "From Anna Wintour's office," he said, reading aloud with growing confidence. "Ms. Wintour watched Mr. Blackstone's press conference with great interest and finds his tactics both transparent and reprehensible. She would like to invite Ms. Washington for an exclusive interview with Vogue to tell her side of the story." Another email chimed in, then another, like dominoes falling in their favor. "Good morning, America," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger with each message. "They want to do a feature on the model who's challenging ageism in fashion, and they specifically want to address the controversy." More emails poured in as the fashion industry's elite chose sides with the speed of people who'd survived decades of industry politics. 60 Minutes, The Today Show, CBS, Sunday Morning, The View. "What's happening?" Amelia asked, confused by the sudden reversal. Dr. Walsh smiled for the first time all day, her understanding of human psychology allowing her to see the larger picture. "What's happening is that Charles just overplayed his hand. The fashion industry doesn't like being lectured by real estate developers about their business practices, especially when those lectures come with obvious ulterior motives." The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews and statements of support that felt like a validation of everything Amelia had fought to achieve. Anna Wintour herself conducted the Vogue interview, her legendary presence lending gravitas to Amelia's story. "I want women to know that it's never too late to reclaim your dreams," she said, looking directly into the camera with the confidence that had been forged in the fire of public scrutiny. "I spent 10 years believing I wasn't enough because someone convinced me my worth was tied to his opinion of me." The interview went viral within hours, shared across social media platforms by women who saw their own struggles reflected in Amelia's story. Never Too Late began trending worldwide, accompanied by messages from women sharing their own stories of deferred dreams and second chances. The Good Morning America appearance was even more powerful. Robin Roberts asked tough questions, but created space for Amelia to tell her truth with the skill of someone who understood the power of authentic storytelling. "You've been accused of being manipulated by your photographer," Robin said, her voice gentle but direct. "How do you respond to that?" "I respond by saying that for the first time in 10 years, someone believed in my dreams instead of diminishing them," Amelia replied, her voice steady with conviction. "Richard Sterling didn't manipulate me. He reminded me who I was before I forgot." The segment concluded with footage from Amelia's test shoots and behind-the-scenes video of her Fashion Week preparation. The transformation was undeniable, from broken wife to confident woman, all captured on camera for the world to see. Meanwhile, Charles's narrative began to crumble under scrutiny. Private investigators hired by Vogue discovered that several of the victims Charles claimed to have documentation about didn't exist. Others turned out to be women who'd had successful modeling careers after working with Richard, their stories deliberately distorted to serve Charles's agenda. The fashion industry's response was swift and unified. Designers, photographers, and models posted statements of support that turned social media into a battlefield where authenticity triumphed over intimidation. Justice for Amelia trended alongside None Never Too Late, creating a movement that extended far beyond modeling into the broader conversation about women's empowerment. 3 days before Fashion Week, Amelia sat in her small apartment, surrounded by flowers sent by supporters, white roses from secret admirers, elaborate arrangements from fashion houses, simple bouquets from women who'd seen her interviews and felt inspired. The contrast with her old life was stark. Then flowers had been decorative elements chosen by professionals. Now they were expressions of genuine support and connection. Richard knocked on her door just as the sun was setting, painting her apartment in golden light that made everything look possible. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling beside her on the small sofa that had become the center of her new world. "Terrified," she admitted, her honesty a luxury she'd learned to afford herself again. "What if I fail? What if Charles is right, and I really am delusional? Then you'll fail spectacularly in front of the entire fashion world, while wearing an incredible dress and looking absolutely stunning," Richard said, his voice warm with affection and confidence. "But you won't fail, Amelia." "How can you be so sure?" "Because 3 weeks ago, you were a woman who'd forgotten her own worth. Tonight, you're a woman who's inspired thousands of others to remember theirs. That's not delusion, that's power." He took her hand, and she felt the calluses from years of handling cameras, the strength that came from building something meaningful with his own efforts. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice suddenly serious in a way that made her heart skip. Her pulse quickened. "What?" "I've been in love with you since sophomore year at Columbia. But watching you find your strength again, seeing you fight for your dreams despite everything Charles has thrown at you." He paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that took her breath away. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Before she could respond, her phone rang with the persistence of important news. The caller ID showed Patricia Mills. "Amelia!" Patricia's voice was breathless when she answered, carrying an excitement that was infectious. "I have news. The Fashion Week show has been moved to the main tent. We've had so many RSVPs that we needed a bigger venue." She paused, and Amelia could hear the smile in her voice. "You're opening the most talked-about show of Fashion Week. Every major editor, buyer, and celebrity in town will be watching. This is your moment, Amelia. Are you ready?" The biggest stage in fashion awaited, but would she rise to meet the moment, or would the pressure of performing in front of the industry's elite and Charles's continued sabotage break her newfound confidence? Chapter 9. Runway Royalty. The backstage area of Bryant Park's main tent thrummed with an energy that felt electric, dangerous and intoxicating all at once, like standing at the center of a storm that could either destroy everything or transform it entirely. Amelia stood before a full-length mirror, watching the final touches being applied to her makeup, while around her, the controlled chaos of Fashion Week reached its crescendo. Models in various stages of undress hurried between clothing racks like butterflies in an expensive garden. Stylists made last-minute adjustments with the precision of surgeons, and photographers captured behind-the-scenes moments that would appear in tomorrow's fashion blogs and next month's magazines. 5 minutes to places, announced the stage manager, a tiny woman with a headset and the organizational skills of a military general commanding an army of beauty. Marcus Thompson made final adjustments to the burgundy gown that would open his Renaissance collection, a celebration of women's power to reinvent themselves that felt like it had been designed specifically for this moment. The dress fit Amelia like it had been painted on her body by an artist who understood exactly how fabric should move with a woman's form, the deep color making her skin glow under the harsh backstage lighting like she was illuminated from within. Remember, Javon Williams said, appearing at her elbow for final coaching, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd trained supermodels and understood the psychology of performance at the highest level. You're not walking for them. You're walking for every woman who's been told she's not enough. Make them believe in possibility again. Through the backstage monitors, Amelia could see the audience settling into their seats like pieces on a chessboard being arranged for the ultimate game. The fashion world's elite occupied the front rows. Anna Wintour in her signature sunglasses and precisely arranged bob, Diane von Furstenberg with her crown of silver hair and regal bearing, Marc Jacobs looking intense and focused like he was studying art in a museum. Celebrities she'd only seen in magazines filled the second tier, their presence adding glamour and generating the kind of media attention that could make or break careers. Buyers, editors and influencers claimed every remaining seat, their phones ready to broadcast every moment to millions of followers around the world. And there, in the third row, wearing his most expensive Armani suit like armor against the judgment he was about to witness, sat Charles. Richard caught her looking at the monitor and appeared at her side like a guardian angel dressed in black. "Don't look at him," he said firmly, his hands gentle on her shoulders, but his voice carrying the strength she'd learned to depend on. "Look at me." When she met his eyes, she saw 15 years of patience, belief, and love that had sustained itself through disappointment and distance, and the kind of hope that most people abandon as they get older. "You are extraordinary," he said, his voice cutting through the backstage noise like a knife through silk. "You always have been. You've just been hiding it under someone else's opinion of you. Tonight, you stop hiding. Tonight, you show them who you really are." The music began, a powerful orchestral piece that built slowly, dramatically, like a story unfolding in real time. Amelia felt her heartbeat synchronize with the rhythm, felt something ancient and powerful awakening in her chest, like a sleeping dragon opening its eyes. "Amelia Washington, you're on!" called the stage manager, her voice carrying the weight of dreams about to be realized or destroyed. She took a breath, feeling the weight of her grandmother's pearls against her throat like a blessing from ancestors who'd fought for her to have this moment. The burgundy silk flowed around her legs like liquid confidence, and she felt the solid ground beneath her feet. Not just the runway, but everything that had brought her to this point. Then she stepped into the light. The runway stretched before her like a bridge between her old life and her new one, between who she'd been told she was and who she actually was. The audience fell silent as she appeared, and for a moment that felt eternal. Amelia stood at the top of the catwalk, owning her space completely. Then she began to walk. Every step was deliberate, powerful, carrying the weight of every woman who'd been told she was too old, too different, not enough. The burgundy gown moved with her like liquid fire, catching the light with each movement and creating an effect that was both elegant and commanding. Her grandmother's pearls caught the camera flashes, creating points of light that seemed to dance around her throat like stars being born. She owned the runway completely, her movement fluid yet commanding, natural yet otherworldly. This wasn't the careful, ladylike walk Charles had preferred. This was the stride of a woman who belonged exactly where she was, who had earned her place through struggle and growth, and the kind of courage that most people never find. At the end of the runway, she executed the turn Javon had drilled into her hundreds of times. But this version was pure instinct, pure confidence, pure joy in her own body and its capabilities. She paused, as custom dictated, letting the photographers capture the moment that would define not just her career, but the broader conversation about beauty and aging and women's power to write their own stories. The silence was pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of expectations and dreams, and the kind of transformation that happens when someone steps fully into their power. Then someone began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the entire tent was on its feet. The applause was thunderous, sustained, building rather than fading like appreciation that refused to be contained. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every angle of this moment that would define not just Amelia's career, but the broader conversation about beauty, age, and women's power to reinvent themselves at any stage of life. Amelia smiled, not the practiced model smile she'd been taught, but the radiant, genuine expression that had captivated Richard 15 years ago. The smile that said, "I belong here, I know I belong here, and nothing you can do will make me leave." It was the smile of a woman who'd found herself again after years of being lost. As she turned to walk back, she caught sight of Charles's face in the audience. The smugness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. And perhaps, for the first time in their entire relationship, respect mixed with regret for what he'd thrown away. Too late, she thought. Far too late. The rest of Marcus Thompson's collection was stunning, flowing fabrics in jewel tones that celebrated every woman's body, designs that made every model look like royalty, clothes that apologized to no one and demanded attention through sheer beauty and confidence. But Amelia had set the tone, established the energy that carried through the entire show, like electricity flowing through a circuit. When all the models returned for the final walk, Amelia led them with the same commanding presence, her fellow models following like disciples following a prophet. Marcus Thompson himself appeared for his bow, grabbing Amelia's hand and raising it high as the applause reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tent. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried over the sound system with the excitement of someone presenting a miracle, "Ms. Amelia Washington." The ovation was deafening, sustained, the kind of response reserved for moments that change everything. Backstage was chaos that felt like celebration and revolution combined. Photographers wanted shots, reporters wanted quotes, other models wanted congratulations. Industry executives pushed through the crowd like prospectors rushing toward gold, business cards and phone numbers appearing like magic. "Versace wants to meet," someone shouted over the noise. "Calvin Klein's people are asking for your availability next month," called another voice. "Milan Fashion Week is calling. They want you for Dolce and Gabbana." The offers came like rain after a drought, each one validating what Amelia had always known but had been convinced to forget, that she was enough, that she was valuable, that she had something the world wanted to see. But Amelia's attention was drawn to movement at the edge of the crowd. Charles was pushing through the backstage chaos, his face a mask of determination and something that might have been desperation, like a man trying to stop a train with his bare hands. Security tried to stop him. Fashion Week credentials were strictly controlled, and ex-husbands of models weren't typically on the guest list. But his name still carried weight in certain circles. He broke through just as Anna Wintour herself was congratulating Amelia on her debut, creating a moment that would be photographed and discussed for years to come. "Amelia?" he called out, his voice carrying across the backstage area and cutting through conversations like a blade through silk. Everyone stopped. Cameras turned. The fashion world's most powerful people waited to see what would happen next, sensing that they were about to witness something historic, either the final humiliation of a desperate man or one last attempt to destroy what couldn't be controlled. Charles stood there, surrounded by the industry that had just embraced his ex-wife with open arms, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. For 10 years, he'd been the most important person in any room they'd entered together. Now, in this tent full of people celebrating her success, he looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd spent a decade diminishing a diamond because he was threatened by its brilliance. The backstage area held its collective breath, waiting for the confrontation that would either crown her triumph or provide Charles with one final opportunity to humiliate her in front of the people whose opinions could make or break her future. What could Charles possibly say in front of the fashion world's elite? And how would this final confrontation resolve the war between who she'd been and who she was becoming? Chapter 10, Crown of Victory. Charles stood in the epicenter of Fashion Week's most talked-about backstage celebration, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire worldview crumble in real time. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Around him, the fashion industry's elite buzzed with excitement about the show they'd just witnessed. Anna Wintour speaking in animated tones with her editors, Marc Jacobs photographing Amelia with his phone like a fan rather than a competitor, Diane von Furstenberg air-kissing models and declaring the evening absolutely magnificent, darling. And in the center of it all stood Amelia, resplendent in her burgundy gown, wearing confidence like a crown that no one could ever take away again. Charles faltered, the smooth voice that had commanded boardrooms and intimidated rivals reduced to uncertain stammering. The man who'd spent 10 years telling her she wasn't enough was confronted with the undeniable reality of her success, surrounded by proof that he'd been catastrophically wrong. "You what, Charles?" Amelia asked, stepping closer. Her voice carried clearly over the backstage noise, causing nearby conversations to pause as people sensed the significance of this moment. He looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in years. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the broken wife he'd left behind. This was a queen in burgundy silk, radiating the kind of power that came from finally knowing her own worth. "I wanted to tell you." He tried again, then stopped. What could he say? That she was wrong to leave him? That she wasn't talented enough to deserve this success? That room full of fashion's most influential people had just proven him spectacularly, publicly wrong. "That I was right?" Amelia interrupted, her voice gentle but uncompromising. "That I was always beautiful enough, talented enough, strong enough, that I just needed to stop listening to someone who benefited from making me small." Richard appeared at her side, not possessively but supportively. The contrast between the two men was devastating. Charles in his desperate hunger for control, Richard in his quiet confidence. One man who'd tried to diminish her, another who'd helped her remember her own light. Anna Wintour herself moved closer, her legendary radar for dramatic moments drawing her to the confrontation. Other industry luminaries followed, creating an impromptu audience of people who would determine fashion's narrative for the next decade. "You threw away a diamond," Richard said simply, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet space, "to play with broken glass." Charles opened his mouth to respond, but what defense could he offer? Every cruel word he'd spoken, every dream he'd crushed, every moment he'd made her feel worthless was reflected back at him in her radiant success. The photographers sensed the moment, not the staged, artificial moments of a typical fashion show, but something real and raw and important. Cameras clicked discreetly, capturing what would become one of the most iconic images of Fashion Week. A woman claiming her power, while the man who tried to steal it stood powerless in her light. "I'm sorry," Charles whispered, and for the first time in their entire relationship, Amelia believed he might actually mean it. "I know you are," she replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd traveled a long road to reach this moment. "But sorry doesn't give me back 10 years, Charles. It doesn't undo the damage. The only thing that could heal that was me, learning to believe in myself again." She turned away from him, toward Richard, toward her future, toward the roomful of people who were already planning her next opportunities. "Amelia," Richard said, and she could hear the emotion in his voice. The crowd seemed to sense what was coming. Even Anna Wintour stepped closer, her expression uncharacteristically soft behind her signature sunglasses. Richard dropped to one knee right there in the backstage chaos, pulling out a ring that caught the light like captured starfire. Not the massive, showy diamond Charles had given her, but something elegant, timeless, chosen with love rather than ego. 15 years ago, "I fell in love with the most extraordinary woman at Columbia University," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the tent. "Tonight, I watched that same woman transform a runway into her throne. Amelia Washington, will you marry me?" The collective gasp from fashion's elite was audible. Anna Wintour actually smiled, a sight rarer than a total solar eclipse. Amelia looked down at this man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had built his dreams around helping her rebuild hers, who had loved her with the patience of someone who knew real value when he saw it. "Yes," she said, and the word rang through the tent like a bell announcing a new era. As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her, the backstage area erupted in celebration. Photographers finally started clicking openly, capturing the moment when New York's newest modeling sensation claimed not just professional success, but the love she deserved. Behind them, Charles Blackstone stood alone in the crowd, watching his former wife being kissed by a man who cherished her. The hollow feeling in his chest told him everything he needed to know about the price of cruelty, the cost of controlling someone instead of loving them. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing into the Manhattan night that had once belonged to him, but now belonged to her. The celebration continued for hours. Contracts were discussed. Shoots were scheduled. Milan beckoned. But all Amelia could focus on was the feeling of Richard's hand in hers and the knowledge that she'd finally come home to herself. 3 months later, Amelia's face graced the cover of Vogue with the headline, "Beauty Redefined, the model who rewrote the rules." The feature inside detailed not just her meteoric rise, but her message to women everywhere. It's never too late to reclaim your dreams, to remember your worth, to refuse to be made small by someone else's fear. The wedding took place the following spring in the gardens behind Columbia University's Fine Arts Building, where Richard had first noticed her photographing white roses 20 years earlier. This time, the promises made were kept, not just between husband and wife, but between a woman and her own reflection in the mirror. As for Charles Blackstone, he eventually married one of his society acquaintances, a woman 20 years younger who looked perfect in photographs but had never made him laugh the way Amelia once had. Sometimes, late at night in his empty penthouse, he would see Amelia's billboards lighting up Times Square and remember what it felt like to hold a diamond while thinking it was glass. But Amelia Washington Sterling never looked back. She was too busy walking forward, carrying herself like the queen she had always been, finally wearing a crown made of her own unshakable worth.